It was late 1943. A cold wind swept across the American heartland. On board a military train, hundreds of weary German prisoners stared out through the barred windows and couldn't believe what they saw. They had been captured in North Africa, veterans of the Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. These were proud, disciplined soldiers of Hitler's once unbeatable army. But now they were prisoners of war, on foreign soil, thousands of miles from home. And as they peered out onto the endless landscape of the United States, their confidence began to crumble, because what they saw wasn't a country struggling under the burden of war. It wasn't the bombed-out ruins of Europe they had come from. It was a nation alive with power, factories roaring, trains screaming, and cities shining brighter than anything they had imagined. For many of these soldiers, that train ride would become a moment of awakening. They realized, for the first time, that Germany could never defeat this. They were witnessing a power so vast, so efficient, so unstoppable, that even the mighty Third Reich seemed small in comparison. This is the forgotten story of how German prisoners of war came face to face with America's industrial might, and how that encounter changed everything they believed about the war, their country, and even themselves. To understand how these men ended up on American soil, we need to step back to the deserts of North Africa in 1942. At that time, Hitler's Wehrmacht still seemed invincible. They had conquered most of Europe, France, the Low Countries, Poland, and vast parts of the Soviet Union. Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening to seize the Suez Canal. But across the Atlantic, America was rising from its slumber. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States had mobilized faster than any nation in history. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks and bombers. Steel plants ran 24 hours a day. By 1943, the U.S. was producing more war material than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Still, that wasn't something the average German soldier truly understood, until they saw it with their own eyes. In May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa finally collapsed. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner, one of the largest mass surrenders of the war. But the Allies faced a huge problem: where to keep them all. Britain was already overcrowded with POWs. The North African camps were temporary and vulnerable. So the United States made a bold decision to bring tens of thousands of German prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean to camps built right on American soil. From 1942 to 1945, over 425,000 German POWs would be shipped to the U.S. They were sent everywhere, from dusty camps in Texas and Oklahoma to frozen outposts in Minnesota and Maine. Most of them had no idea what to expect. The journey itself was a shock. They were transported on massive Allied troop ships, escorted by destroyers through submarine-infested waters. Many expected to die before reaching land. After all, Allied propaganda had painted America as chaotic and vengeful, a land of mob violence and hatred for Germans. But what they found was not very different. When the ships docked in places like Norfolk, Virginia, or New York Harbor, the prisoners looked out and saw something almost surreal. Endless lines of cranes unloading supplies, trains stretching as far as the eye could see. Skyscrapers untouched by war. The docks were alive with workers, men and women, all moving with machine-like coordination. One German POW later recalled, "We had been told America was weak, but when I saw the harbor, I knew we had lost the war." After being processed by the U.S. Army, the POWs were divided and sent by train to different camps across the nation. And it was during those train rides, cutting through the heart of America, that the true scale of what they faced became clear. They passed through towns buzzing with life, farms bursting with food, and cities blazing with lights even in wartime. No shortages, no destruction, no fear. To them, it was shocking, because back in Germany, cities were being bombed nightly. Food was rationed. Morale was breaking. But here was a country at war, yet thriving as if peace had never left. Narrator, lower, emotional. One POW, A young Luftwaffe mechanic named Karl Schneider later wrote in his diary, "When our train passed through Kansas, I saw children laughing and playing in the streets. In Germany, there were no children laughing anymore. Only sirens, rubble, and funerals. It was moments like that, simple, human moments, that began to crack the iron wall of Nazi propaganda." The prisoners started asking themselves, if this is what the enemy's country looks like, what have we been fighting for? But the real shock was yet to come, because once these German soldiers stepped off those trains and into the American POW camps, they would see firsthand the full scale of the United States industrial power and the freedom, wealth, and humanity that fueled it. For many of them, it would not only shatter their loyalty to Hitler, it would transform their view of the world forever. This is where the story truly begins, in the heart of America, where even the enemy couldn't help but be amazed. The doors slid open, and a wave of sunlight flooded the rail cars. The men blinked, shielding their eyes from the brightness. After weeks on the ocean and days inside dark, rattling trains, they finally stepped onto American soil, a place most had only heard about in propaganda broadcasts. For the thousands of German POWs arriving in 1943 and 1944, it was a surreal experience. They expected hostility, filth, and vengeance. But what they found instead were organized camps, clean facilities, and even, to their disbelief, kindness. As they marched through small American towns toward their new camps, locals came out to watch. Some were curious, others cautious. But many were simply stunned to see enemy soldiers walking down their streets under guard. And for the Germans, they were stunned for another reason. They saw brand new cars, well-fed civilians, grocery stores overflowing with food, and all of it in the middle of a war. One prisoner remembered seeing a convoy of trucks rolling past. Every truck was gleaming, freshly painted, brand new. He whispered to a comrade, "In Germany, a truck like that would be worth gold." Another POW later wrote in a letter home, "If our people saw this, they would stop believing Hitler's lies about America being poor and weak." The propaganda of the Third Reich had painted the US as a chaotic, racially divided land crippled by capitalism. But what they saw contradicted everything they had been told. The United States was thriving, a nation so industrially powerful that even in wartime its citizens lived comfortably. Most POWs were taken to the heart of the country, far from the coasts, deep into the American Midwest and South. States like Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, and Georgia became home to sprawling POW camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Algona in Iowa, Camp Swift near Austin, these were just a few of the hundreds that dotted the nation. Each camp could hold thousands of prisoners, and by the end of the war, there were over 500 such facilities across the United States. But these weren't brutal concentration camps like those in Europe. They were run according to the Geneva Convention, with rules ensuring fair treatment, decent food, and humane conditions. For many Germans, it was their first taste of true democracy, not through words or speeches, but through how their captors treated them. They were given proper bunks, uniforms, and 3 meals a day, meals that often included meat, fresh bread, and coffee. To men who had been living on dry rations and moldy potatoes, it was almost unbelievable. At Camp Swift, one POW joked, "If this is captivity, then I hope we lose the war quickly." American guards sometimes chuckled at the irony. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought fiercely in Africa, Italy, and France. And yet here they were, marveling at the abundance of food and the fairness of their treatment. Some prisoners even said the camps were better than life back home under rationing and constant bombings. But it wasn't just the comfort that shocked them. It was the efficiency. Everywhere they looked, the American machine was in motion, effortlessly coordinated, endlessly productive. In Camp Hearn, the prisoners watched American trucks deliver supplies with clockwork precision. They saw local farmers using massive tractors and modern harvesters, machines Germany couldn't dream of building in such numbers. And at night, the horizon glowed faintly orange from distant factories running 24 hours a day. To them, It felt like America itself was one giant engine, unstoppable and humming with life. Some POWs began working on nearby farms or factories as part of labor programs. Under Geneva rules, non-commissioned officers could volunteer for work, and many did. Not out of loyalty to Germany, but out of curiosity and boredom. And what they saw while working shocked them even more. They saw American women driving tractors and welding steel, teenagers managing production lines, factories where the output in one day exceeded what some German plants produced in a week. It was, in every sense, a different world. One German engineer, captured in Tunisia and later sent to a camp in Illinois, was astonished by what he witnessed. "They do not fear shortages," he wrote in his diary. "They build as if resources are infinite. Every tool, every machine, every road, everything is built bigger, stronger, faster. It is a wonder they do not rule the world already." That engineer wasn't wrong. By 1944, American factories were producing 96,000 aircraft, 57,000 landing craft, 49,000 tanks, and over 8 million tons of shipping. No other nation in history had ever matched such output, and for the German soldiers seeing it up close, it was terrifying. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came when some POWs realized that even amid abundance, America wasn't arrogant. They were treated fairly, even respectfully, by their guards and by the civilians they worked for. In some small towns, farmers would share a meal with the German workers after a long day in the field. Children would wave at them. Local women baked bread for them at Christmas. It was confusing. How could the enemy, the nation they had been told was evil and corrupt, show them such humanity? That question began to haunt many prisoners. It lingered in their letters, in their thoughts, and in the whispered conversations in the barracks at night. Because if America truly was what their leaders had claimed, greedy, weak, divided, then how could this country produce so much, fight so fiercely, and still treat its enemies with dignity? It was a contradiction that would tear at their beliefs, and for some, change them forever. But as the months went on, and German POWs began to understand the deeper strength of the American system, they would come to realize that what they were witnessing wasn't just industrial power. It was the strength of a free society in motion. As the German prisoners settled into their new environment, something unexpected began to unfold. What had started as disbelief slowly turned into astonishment, and for some, even admiration. These men, many of whom had been hardened by years of Nazi propaganda, were about to face a reality that completely shattered their worldview. As they peered out through barred windows, they expected to see a war-torn country, rationed and struggling like Europe. After all, wasn't the United States fighting a global war on two fronts? But what they saw instead was something unimaginable. Endless stretches of factories, farms, and bustling cities, all untouched by bombs. The skies were clear, roads smooth, and everywhere they looked, industry was alive and thriving. One prisoner later recalled, "We thought the Americans were suffering like us. But the land was green, the people were smiling, and the factories, they never stopped." To men who had seen German cities reduced to rubble, this was unthinkable. In the Midwest, trains carrying POWs often passed through Chicago, Detroit, or Pittsburgh. These industrial powerhouses were the beating heart of America's war machine, producing tanks, planes, and ships at a pace the world had never seen before. For the prisoners, the scale of production seemed inhuman. Imagine it. While Germany struggled to repair a single bombed-out factory, America was churning out one B-24 bomber every hour at Ford's Willow Run plant. At the Kaiser shipyards, a Liberty ship could be assembled in less than 5 days. The prisoners couldn't comprehend it. Some thought it was a trick, a staged illusion meant to intimidate them. But it wasn't. When they arrived at the POW camps, places like Camp Swift in Texas, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, and Camp Concordia in Kansas, the surprises continued. Many expected harsh treatment or vengeance. Instead, they found clean barracks, organized systems, and food rations that were, in many cases, better than what American civilians were getting due to wartime restrictions. Meals often included meat, fresh bread, coffee, and fruit, luxuries unimaginable in wartime Germany. One stunned German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We are prisoners, yet we eat like kings compared to the soldiers at the front." How is this possible? It was possible because America's industrial might ensured abundance even during total war. The US wasn't merely surviving, it was thriving, and these prisoners were witnessing it firsthand. Their daily routines deepened the shock. Many POWs were assigned to work on farms, lumber mills, and factories, under supervision, but with fair treatment. They saw how efficiently everything ran, how ordinary citizens, men, women, even teenagers, played their roles in the massive war effort. Women worked assembly lines, replacing men who had gone to war. Trucks, tractors, and machines replaced the labor of dozens of workers, something the Germans hadn't imagined possible at such a scale. Some POWs began asking themselves dangerous questions. How could we ever have thought we could defeat this? For others, the internal conflict was even greater. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as decadent and weak, a culture of chaos and moral decay. Yet here they were, witnessing discipline, organization, and productivity on a scale that outmatched anything they had known. In one camp, a German officer reportedly said to his guards, "If we had factories like yours, we would have won the war in a year." His American captors simply smiled. The sense of shock deepened as the POWs realized that this was not just an isolated show of power, it was a reflection of the entire American system. Everywhere they went, they saw modernity, mechanized agriculture, endless rows of automobiles, and electricity in every small town. To Germans who had grown up in villages still reliant on horses and hand tools, this was a glimpse into the future. But it wasn't just about machines or technology. What struck many of them most was the attitude of the American people. Civilians treated them not with hatred, but with indifference or even friendliness. Some farmers would bring them lemonade on hot days, or chat casually with the men who, just months earlier, had been their enemies. It was an experience that confused and disarmed many German soldiers. Their entire belief system, built on the superiority of the Reich and the idea that America was weak and divided, was being dismantled, piece by piece. By 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners were living across the United States. Each of them was seeing with their own eyes that America's strength wasn't just military, it was economic, social, and moral. And as those realizations sank in, something began to change deep within them. Some began to question their loyalty to the Nazi regime. Others became obsessed with understanding how this nation, built on immigration, diversity, and democracy, had managed to outproduce and outfight the so-called master race. And soon, those questions would lead to tensions between prisoners themselves. Not everyone could accept what they were seeing. Fanatical Nazis among them refused to believe the truth. And they would do everything in their power to silence those who did. That's where the real conflict inside the camps would begin. As the months passed, the German POW camps in America became a strange reflection of the war they had left behind, divided, tense, and quietly dangerous. The physical conflict had ended for these men, but an ideological war had just begun. Inside the barbed wire fences, prisoners split into two groups. On one side were the hardcore Nazis, men still loyal to Hitler, who clung to their belief that Germany's eventual victory was inevitable. On the other side were the realists, the ones who had seen enough of America's overwhelming strength to know the truth. The war was lost, and the Third Reich was doomed. At first, the divide was subtle. Whispered arguments during roll call, cold glares in the mess hall. But soon, it grew into something darker. Fanatical prisoners began organizing secret groups called the Iron Fist or Werewolf Circles. They saw it as their duty to maintain discipline, silence defeatists, and punish anyone who questioned Nazi ideology. Some even created makeshift courts to try fellow prisoners accused of treason to the fatherland. If a man admitted that America was superior, or worse, expressed admiration for American freedom or industry, he risked a beating, or worse. In one Texas camp, A young Luftwaffe pilot named Hans was found dead in his bunk. Officially, it was ruled suicide, but others whispered he'd been murdered for telling his guards that Germany could never match America's production power. The guards found a note on his desk that read, "They will not let me speak the truth." These internal conflicts shocked American officers who had expected the camps to remain orderly. They had underestimated how deeply ideology ran in the hearts of some German soldiers. To the most fanatical among them, even in defeat, the Nazi dream could not die. But outside those dark corners of fanaticism, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Many prisoners began to embrace the opportunity to learn, observe, and adapt. Some were allowed to read American newspapers, listen to radio broadcasts, or even attend educational classes set up by camp authorities. It was during these programs that the real cultural exchange began. German engineers, mechanics, and students were exposed to American ideas of freedom, capitalism, and democracy. And to their amazement, it wasn't propaganda, it was working. They saw workers who could question their bosses, journalists who criticized the government, and a system where innovation was rewarded, not restricted by political loyalty. To men raised under Hitler's totalitarian grip, it was mind-blowing. One POW later recalled, "In Germany, everything was for the Führer. In America, everything was for progress." The turning point came when many POWs started working directly in American factories and farms. Under the Geneva Convention, they were allowed to labor as long as it wasn't in direct support of the war, so they harvested crops, built roads, repaired equipment, and packed goods, side by side with American civilians. And in doing so, they saw something extraordinary. American efficiency wasn't driven by fear or punishment, but by motivation and pride. Workers laughed, played music, and even joked with supervisors. Women in overalls ran complex machinery with confidence. Teenagers drove tractors that, in Germany, only trained engineers would be trusted with. The prisoners couldn't help but compare. In Nazi Germany, mistakes meant punishment. Here they meant learning. One German mechanic in a Kansas camp reportedly said to his fellow inmates, "If this is what democracy creates, we never stood a chance." Yet for every prisoner enlightened by these experiences, there were others sinking deeper into denial. Some continued to believe that what they saw was a facade, that the real America was poor and chaotic. They convinced themselves that the United States would crumble the moment the war ended. But as the Allied advances in Europe became impossible to ignore, D-Day, the fall of Paris, and eventually the approach to Berlin, even the most stubborn began to waver. The radio reports, though censored, carried whispers of collapse. Still, inside the camps, tension simmered. Some POWs secretly celebrated when they learned of German defeats. Others grew violent at the mere mention of surrender. By early 1945, with Germany on the brink, the ideological battle among the prisoners reached its boiling point. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a group of pro-Nazi inmates murdered a fellow German soldier for expressing hope that the war would soon end and Hitler would be gone. The killers hung a sign on his body that read, "He talked too much." American guards were horrified. The FBI was called in. The men responsible were later executed, but the message was clear. Even thousands of miles from the front, the war inside the hearts of these men raged on. At the same time, outside the camp fences, America's industrial power continued to soar. Factories were producing at record levels, new cities were rising, and even as the war wound down, the nation was preparing for the post-war boom. For the German prisoners watching from within those fences, it was undeniable proof of something greater. The scale of American success wasn't temporary. It was systemic, built into the nation's foundation. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the prisoners had lived through a psychological transformation few could have predicted. They had arrived as proud soldiers of the Reich, convinced of their nation's superiority. Now many were humbled men, silent, reflective, and deeply aware that they had seen the future, and it belonged not to the Third Reich, but to the United States of America. But what would happen when they were sent home? Would they carry these lessons with them? or bury them under the ruins of their defeated homeland? That question would soon define the next chapter of their journey. By the spring of 1945, the world had changed forever. Berlin was in ruins, Hitler was dead, and the once mighty Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally. For the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners scattered across America, the war that had defined their lives was finally over. But now came a new kind of uncertainty. What would happen next? Would they be executed? Imprisoned for life? Or sent home? The answer came slowly, and it wasn't simple. With Germany devastated and the Allies struggling to stabilize Europe, the POWs in America weren't sent home immediately. For many, that home no longer even existed. Their towns were bombed out, their families displaced, their homeland divided between the Soviets and the Western Allies. So, for months, some even years, after Germany's surrender, tens of thousands of these German prisoners remained behind American fences. But the atmosphere inside those camps had transformed entirely. The flags and symbols of the Reich were gone. The propaganda-filled lectures had ended. In their place, something remarkable began to grow: understanding. For the first time, many of these men dropped the facade of loyalty to a fallen regime. They began speaking freely about the lies they had been fed. The stories of Nazi atrocities, stories they had once dismissed as enemy propaganda, now reached them through credible sources, through photographs, through returning soldiers who confirmed the unthinkable truth. Some men wept openly, others sat in silence, unable to reconcile the reality of the concentration camps with the patriotic pride they had once felt. A POW named Wilhelm Keller later wrote, "In America, I learned that we were not the master race. We were merely human, and terribly mistaken." That realization marked the turning point in their lives. In the months that followed, the U.S. government introduced programs to help re-educate German prisoners, teaching them about democracy, free speech, and the structure of a government not based on fear. The Americans didn't want revenge. They wanted to plant the seeds of something that could rebuild Germany, a generation that had seen the difference between tyranny and freedom with their own eyes. In the camps, makeshift libraries opened, filled with translated American classics: Mark Twain, Lincoln's speeches, even Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Former Nazi officers found themselves debating philosophy with American professors who volunteered their time. And when they were assigned to work details, something even more extraordinary happened. Many POWs built real friendships with the Americans they worked for. Farmers invited them into their homes for meals. Children waved to them as they passed. One POW named Eric Lehnert, who had worked on a cotton farm in Arkansas, wrote in his diary, "These people treated us better than we treated our own countrymen. I saw that a man can be respected even when he is lost." By the end of 1945, the U.S. began repatriating POWs, sending them back to Europe in large convoys. But these weren't the same men who had arrived years earlier. On the voyage home, the conversations weren't about Hitler's lost empire or vengeance. They were about freedom, technology, and the future. Many spoke of the marvels they had witnessed: the gigantic assembly lines, the democratic debates broadcast on radio, the sight of women working confidently in roles once reserved for men. They had seen a country not crippled by ideology, but driven by unity and purpose. When the ships docked in Europe, the POWs were greeted by a land in chaos. Germany was a wasteland, its cities bombed into rubble, its economy shattered, its people starving. The returning soldiers were met with suspicion, resentment, or pity. But among them was something new, a quiet resolve. Many of these former POWs became essential in rebuilding post-war Germany. They had seen how freedom could function. They understood that power didn't have to come from control. It could come from opportunity. Some of them became teachers, engineers, or local politicians who would later help shape West Germany's democracy. Historians often credit the Marshall Plan and Allied occupation for Germany's recovery. But hidden within that story is this forgotten element: the transformation of thousands of German minds who had glimpsed America's strength up close, not on the battlefield but behind the fences of POW camps. One American guard, years later, summarized it perfectly. We didn't just capture their soldiers. We captured their illusions. It's hard to imagine the irony of it. Men who had once fought to destroy democracy, now returning home as some of its earliest advocates. As one German officer wrote in 1947, America's real weapon was not the bomb or the tank. It was belief in freedom, in progress, in each man's worth. That is what conquered us. But not every POW embraced this revelation. Some remained bitter, others broken. A few even joined extremist movements back home, unable to let go of the past. Yet, the overwhelming majority carried with them a deep respect for the nation that had treated them not as monsters, but as men. And for many, the memory of that first moment on American soil, when they stepped off those trains expecting hatred, only to find decency, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The story of the German POWs in America is not one of defeat. It's one of transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful victories are not won with weapons, but with ideas. But what became of these men in the decades after the war? How many returned to visit the land that had once imprisoned them, and later inspired them? The answer, as you'll see, is both surprising and deeply human. When the last German POW ships finally departed from American shores in 1946 and 1947, the United States thought it had closed a chapter in history. The barbed wire was taken down. The wooden barracks were dismantled or converted into storage sheds. The camps that once echoed with the sounds of marching boots and German songs fell silent. But for the men who had lived inside those fences, those thousands of captured soldiers who had witnessed America's astonishing power firsthand, the story was far from over. Many of them carried their memories of America like a secret treasure. They returned to a homeland scarred by war, divided by occupation, and haunted by guilt. But they also returned with something precious, a vision of what their country could become. In the late 1940s and 1950s, historians began to notice something remarkable. A large number of these former POWs were quietly helping rebuild West Germany, not just physically, but politically and culturally. Some of the men who had worked on American farms became agricultural experts in post-war Germany, introducing new farming methods they'd learned from American farmers. Others became teachers, engineers, or even mayors, helping shape a new, democratic Germany from the ruins of the old Reich. One former prisoner, Rudolf Peterson, who spent 3 years in a Texas camp, later became a successful businessman in Hamburg. He would often tell his colleagues, "I learned more about freedom behind barbed wire than I ever did in Hitler's Germany." Another man, Karl-Heinz Schwarz, who had worked in an Iowa canning factory, later helped modernize Germany's post-war food industry. When asked what inspired him, he simply said, "I saw how the Americans wasted nothing and valued everything." By the 1960s, dozens of these former POWs even returned to the United States, not as prisoners, but as tourists, students, and friends. Many sought out the very families who had once employed them on farms or factories during their captivity. There are countless stories of warm reunions, hugs, and shared meals, decades after the war. One American farmer in Nebraska received a letter in 1964 from a former German POW who had worked for him 20 years earlier. The letter began, "I came as your enemy. You treated me as a man. And because of that, I became your friend." But perhaps the most shocking realization came from historians studying these men years later. Many of them had been among the first Germans to reject Nazism entirely and embrace democratic ideals, not because of Allied propaganda, but because of what they personally witnessed in America. It's estimated that by 1947, around 371,000 German POWs had been held in the United States. Nearly all of them were exposed in some way to the reality of American life and the sheer industrial power that had made their defeat inevitable. They saw cities that thrived without fear, factories that built abundance instead of destruction, and ordinary people who lived with dignity, not ideology. When interviewed years later, one POW named Ernst Simon summed up what thousands of others felt. When I left Germany, I was proud of our discipline and order. When I left America, I was proud of their freedom. And perhaps that was America's quietest, yet greatest victory of the war. Because while guns and bombs had defeated the Third Reich, it was the American spirit, its faith in freedom, industry, and human dignity that conquered the hearts and minds of its former enemies. Even today, remnants of that era still exist. Some of the old POW camp foundations can be found in places like Texas, Georgia, and Kansas. Local residents still tell stories passed down from their parents. Stories of the German boys who built barns, harvested crops, or played soccer with local kids during wartime. In some towns, the descendants of those families still exchange Christmas cards with the descendants of their one-time prisoners. It's a haunting reminder that, even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can flicker to life in the most unexpected places. The story of the German POWs in America isn't just a tale of defeat. It's a story of transformation, of how men sent to destroy a nation came to admire it, and how compassion and strength turned enemies into students, and, eventually, into allies.
And here's the twist that few people realize. When the Cold War began, many of those former POWs were among the strongest advocates for the United States in Europe. They became voices of reason against Soviet influence, convinced that the model they had seen in America was the one that could save their continent from another descent into tyranny.
In that way, the legacy of those POW camps, quiet, forgotten, and surrounded by cornfields, helped shape the post-war world more than anyone at the time could have imagined. As one former Luftwaffe pilot wrote in his memoir, "We thought we were being taken prisoner, but America took our hatred prisoner instead." That perhaps was the real victory. So next time you think about World War II, remember that its battles weren't only fought in the skies over Europe or the islands of the Pacific. They were also fought in the minds of men far from the front lines in the heart of America. If you found this story as powerful and eye-opening as we did, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, the hidden tales of courage, humanity, and transformation that changed history forever. And as always, thank you for watching.